I used to think that the way I saw myself was just the truth. Like, this is me, this is how I am, end of story. But here's what I've learned. Most of us don't actually see ourselves. We see a version of ourselves shaped by old stories, past failures, and what other people have told us. And sometimes that version isn't even close to the truth. I was on a flight once sitting next to a woman who within 5 minutes had apologized 3 times. For what? I have no idea. She bumped into me reaching for her bag. Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. She adjusted her seatbelt. I'm the worst. So sorry. She sneezed. Oh, sorry about that. At some point, I just looked at her and said, you don't have to apologize for existing. She laughed, but then she got quiet. And after a beat, she said, I don't even realize I do it. That's the thing about how we see ourselves. It's often automatic, shaped by old narratives we don't even question. So let's question them. I want to tell you something that might shake things up a little. The way you see yourself, it's not the truth. It's a story. And like all stories, it's been shaped by experiences, people, and moments. Some good, some not, some. But here's the problem. Most of us don't realize we're carrying around an outdated script. A while back, I was talking to a woman who told me, I've never been good at speaking up. I just freeze. I'm not the kind of person who's brave in the moment. And I asked, when did you decide that? She looked at me like I had 3 heads. Because to her, this wasn't a decision. It was a fact. It was just the way she was. But as we kept talking, she told me about a moment in the 3rd grade when she got an answer wrong in front of the whole class. The kids laughed, the teacher moved on, but that moment, it stuck. It became a line in her story. I don't speak up because I'm not good at it. And that story followed her through middle school, into high school, into meetings at work where she had ideas but kept them to herself. Now, here's what's wild. She had spoken up since then, plenty of times, but her brain didn't hold on to those moments. It held on to the time she got laughed at. That's how our minds work. Research shows that we're wired with something called the negativity bias, which means we latch onto negative experiences way more than positive ones. You might get 100 compliments, but if one person criticizes you, guess what your brain holds on to? Yeah, the criticism. So if you've ever thought, I'm not smart enough, I'm not creative, I don't have what it takes, ask yourself, where did that belief come from? Because I promise you, you weren't born thinking that. Those thoughts came from somewhere. Maybe it was a parent who meant well but constantly pointed out your mistakes. Maybe it was a boss who made you feel small. Or maybe it was just one moment, one tiny moment that left a big mark. But just because something feels true doesn't mean it is true. I once read a study where researchers asked people to recall their most defining memories, moments that shaped how they saw themselves. Then they went back and fact-checked those memories with people who were actually there. You know what happened? Over and over again, the memories people had been carrying for years, their most painful identity-shaping moments, were often exaggerated or even distorted. The story they told themselves wasn't completely true. And if that's the case, then here's the question. What stories have you been carrying about yourself that might not be true? I had to wrestle with this myself. For years, I believed I wasn't the kind of person who could be disciplined. I had this running joke that I was just bad at structure, that I wasn't one of those organized together people. And then one day, my husband looked at me and said, you do hard things all the time. You just don't give yourself credit for them. And it hit me, he was right. I had been holding on to a version of myself that wasn't even accurate anymore. So I want to challenge you. Think about a belief you have about yourself. Maybe you think you're not good at relationships. Maybe you believe you're not creative, or that you'll never be successful, or that you're too much, or not enough. And then ask yourself, is this true? Or is it just something I started believing a long time ago? Because the stories we tell about ourselves shape everything. what we try, what we don't, what we believe is possible. And the moment you start questioning them, the moment you start rewriting that script, that's when everything begins to change. I want to tell you something that might feel a little uncomfortable at first. Your worth is not something you earn. It's not a performance. It's not a checklist of achievements. It's not measured by how productive you are, how many people approve of you, or how perfectly you manage to hold it all together. But if you're anything like me, that idea doesn't exactly come naturally. I grew up believing that being good meant being useful, that the way to prove my value was to work harder, achieve more, and make sure no one ever had a reason to question whether I was doing enough. I think a lot of us carry that belief, especially if we were praised for being responsible as kids, or if we learned early on that love and approval came with conditions. And so we perform. We hustle for our worth. We overcommit. We take on more than we should because we don't want to let anyone down. We say yes when we mean no. We become the person who's always fine, always handling it, always doing just a little bit more. And at the end of the day, we collapse into bed exhausted, wondering why we never quite feel like we're enough. I was talking to a friend about this once, someone who, on paper, had it all together. She was successful, respected, a person everyone counted on. And she told me, I don't know how to stop. If I'm not achieving something, I feel like I'm failing. And I don't even know who I am outside of being the capable one. That hit me, because isn't that the fear, that if we stop proving ourselves, we'll somehow disappear? That if we're not producing, achieving, or being useful, then maybe we don't matter as much? But here's what I've learned. Self-worth that's based on performance is exhausting. It's never enough. Because the second you hit one goal, there's another. The second you meet one expectation, there's a new one. It's a treadmill with no off switch. And here's the real kicker. When we tie our worth to external validation, we give other people way too much power. If your value is based on how well you perform at work, what happens when you make a mistake? If your worth comes from being the strong one, what happens when you need help? If you believe you're only lovable when you're easy to be around, what happens when you're struggling? Your worth has to be something deeper, something unshakable, something that doesn't rise and fall based on what you accomplish. I once heard someone ask, what if your only job in life was just to be? What if that was enough? And I felt that question in my bones, because we are so used to doing that. The idea of just being, of believing we are enough without anything to prove, feels radical. But here's the truth. You don't have to hustle for your worthiness. You don't have to keep proving you deserve to be here. You already do, right now, as you are. And if that feels hard to believe, I want you to think about someone you love, not for what they do, not for what they achieve, but just for who they are. Maybe it's a child, a best friend, a partner, a parent. You don't love them because they check all the right boxes. You love them because they exist, because they're them. So why would you be any different? You are worthy, full stop, no conditions, no performance required. If I asked you to think about the last time you messed up, like really messed up, how long would it take you? A second? Maybe two? Most of us can recall our mistakes, embarrassments, and shortcomings at lightning speed. Now, what if I asked you to think about the last time you gave yourself grace? When was the last time you spoke to yourself with kindness instead of criticism? That question? A little harder to answer. We are, hands down, our own worst critics. I don't care how much love and compassion you have for other people. The way you talk to yourself, probably brutal. The voice in our head is often sharp, unforgiving, and relentless. It tells us we should have known better, done better, tried harder. It reminds us of every flaw, every misstep, every time we weren't enough. And here's the thing. Most of us don't even question it. We just assume that voice is telling the truth. I was talking to a woman once who told me, I feel like I've been failing as a mom. I'm always behind. I forget things. I don't have the patience I wish I had. She looked exhausted, and I asked her, if your best friend came to you and said those exact words, what would you say to her? She didn't even hesitate. I'd tell her she's doing her best, that she's a good mom, that one hard day doesn't define her. And then she got quiet because she realized she had never extended that same kindness to herself. We are so good at offering compassion to others. We tell our friends to be gentle with themselves. We remind them that they're human. We lift them up when they're struggling. But when it comes to ourselves, we don't just drop the ball. We spike it into the ground. I used to believe that being hard on myself was the price of growth. That if I let up even a little, I'd lose my edge, get lazy, stop improving. But research tells a different story. People who practice self-compassion, who treat themselves with the same kindness they'd offer a loved one, are actually more resilient. They bounce back faster, take more risks, and are less afraid of failure. Because when you know you won't tear yourself apart every time you make a mistake, you're more willing to step outside your comfort zone. Self-compassion isn't about letting yourself off the hook. It's not about making excuses. It's about recognizing that you're human, and humans struggle. Humans get it wrong. Humans have hard days and big emotions and moments where they don't show up as their best selves. And in those moments, the question isn't, why am I like this? It's, what do I need right now? Maybe you need rest. Maybe you need support. Maybe you just need to remind yourself that one bad moment doesn't define you. I want you to think about the thing you've been beating yourself up for lately, the thing that keeps replaying in your mind. And then I want you to imagine someone you love telling you that exact same story. What would you say to them? What would you want them to know? Now, say that to yourself. You don't have to earn your own kindness. You don't have to be perfect to be worthy of grace. You are already enough, even on the hard days, even in the mess, even when you don't feel like it. And the sooner you start treating yourself like someone who matters, the sooner everything else starts to change. There's this moment that happens in all of our lives, usually more than once, where we look around and think, is this really me? Is this really who I am? It can happen in big ways, waking up one day and realizing you've built a life that doesn't actually feel like yours. But it also happens in small, quiet moments, like when you say yes to something you don't want to do because you don't want to disappoint anyone, or when you shrink yourself in a conversation because you don't want to come across as too much, or when you hold back from trying something new because the voice in your head says that's not who you are. The stories we tell about ourselves shape everything. They shape what we believe we're capable of. They shape what we allow ourselves to want. And most of the time, we don't even realize we're following a script that someone else wrote. I was talking to a man once who told me, I've never been creative. My brother was the artistic one. I was the responsible one. He said it like it was an absolute fact, like it had been carved into stone at birth. So I asked him, okay, but did you ever actually want to be creative? Did you ever try? And he laughed and said, well, yeah, when I was a kid, I used to draw all the time. But my brother was better at it, so I just kind of stopped. That's how it happens. We pick up these labels along the way, the quiet one, the funny one, the responsible one, the difficult one. And they become part of our identity. But what if those labels were never really ours to begin with? What if they were just roles we stepped into because it made sense at the time? What if we've been carrying them long after they stopped fitting? Here's the truth that most of us don't realize until much later than we should. You get to decide who you are. You get to decide what kind of life you want to live, what kind of person you want to be, what parts of yourself you want to grow and nurture. Your identity isn't something that was handed to you at birth with a note that says, this is who you'll be forever. It's something you get to choose. But that choice, it's terrifying. Because change, even when it's the kind that brings us closer to who we really are, comes with loss. The loss of old expectations. the loss of certainty. Sometimes even the loss of relationships with people who only knew the version of you that played small, that stayed quiet, that didn't ask for too much. That's the part that stops most people. We tell ourselves, this is just the way I am. This is just how life works. People like me don't do things like that. And we accept a story that was written long before we had the awareness to question it. But here's what I want to say to you. What if you let yourself be something different? What if you stopped living inside the limits of an old identity and let yourself evolve? What if you allowed yourself to want something more, something different, something bigger? Because the most freeing, terrifying, beautiful truth is this. You are not stuck. You are not defined by the roles you've played in the past. You are allowed to change your mind. You are allowed to grow. You are allowed to step into a life that actually feels like it belongs to you. And the moment you start to believe that, everything shifts. I think one of the hardest things we ever do is let ourselves be fully seen. Not the curated, polished version. Not the I've got it all together version. I mean the real, messy, complicated human version of who we are. Because being seen means being vulnerable. And vulnerability, it's terrifying. We live in a world that teaches us to armor up, to filter our words, to present ourselves in ways that make us more acceptable, to hide the parts of ourselves that might be too much or not enough. And we do it because deep down we believe that if people really knew us, if they saw the insecurities, the fears, the struggles, they might not love us in the way we so desperately want to be loved. I was talking to a man once who told me, I've spent my whole life trying to be who I thought people wanted me to be. I worked hard. I built a successful career. I did everything right. But now I don't even know if the people around me love me for me or if they just love the version of me I've been showing them. That hit me. Because how many of us are walking around with that same fear? How many of us have spent years, maybe even decades, performing a version of ourselves that feels safer, more acceptable, more likable? And in doing so, we've ended up feeling lonelier than ever. Because love, real love, can only exist where there is truth. But here's what I've learned about truth. It's uncomfortable. It means admitting when we're struggling. It means speaking up when something isn't working instead of pretending we're fine. It means asking for what we need, even when there's a chance we might not get it. It means letting go of the idea that being loved and accepted is about earning it, and instead realizing that real connection only happens when we show up as our whole selves. The first time I really understood this, I was sitting with a friend who was going through something painful. And she told me, I don't want to be a burden. And I looked at her and said, if the roles were reversed, would you want me to feel like I couldn't lean on you? She shook her head immediately. Of course not. That's the trick our minds play on us. We tell ourselves that our struggles make us weak, that we have to handle everything on our own, that needing support means we're failing. But when we flip it around, when we imagine the people we love coming to us for support, we don't see them as burdens. We see them as human. And the strongest, bravest thing we can do is let ourselves be human too. I know vulnerability feels risky. I know it feels easier to keep the mask on, to stay in control, to avoid the possibility of rejection. But I also know this, the cost of hiding is much greater. Because when we hide, we don't just shield ourselves from potential pain, we also block ourselves from the deep, meaningful, soul-filling connections that only happen when we let ourselves be fully seen. So here's what I want you to consider. What would it look like to be just a little more honest, a little more open, a little more you? What would it feel like to stop performing and just be? Because the people who are meant for you, the ones who truly see you, who truly love you, they don't need the polished version. They just need you. At the end of the day, the way you see yourself shapes everything. It shapes the way you move through the world, the way you let others treat you, the dreams you allow yourself to chase, and the love you believe you deserve. And if the story you've been telling yourself isn't one of worthiness, of courage, of possibility, then maybe it's time to change the narrative. You are not defined by your past. You are not limited by old labels. You are not here to perform for approval or hustle for your worth. You are here to live fully, to embrace who you are, messy, brilliant, imperfect, and whole. So my challenge for you is this. Start seeing yourself the way you would see someone you love. Start speaking to yourself with kindness. Start believing that you are enough. Not someday, not when you achieve more, not when you finally get it all figured out, but right now. Because when you change the way you see yourself, you change the way you show up in your own life. And when you do that, everything else begins to shift. Good luck on this journey of stepping into your full, authentic self. And from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Thank you for showing up, for listening, for being open to the kind of change that takes real courage. You deserve a life that feels like it truly belongs to you. Now go live it.